Catherine and Jessica today. Welcome, ladies.
Hello.
So stop me at any time if you have questions. Today we're going to be focusing on how to write a contingency. So obviously the offer and addendum A are filled with pre-written contingencies that a buyer can choose to insert into their offer. But sometimes we might have a situation where the buyer needs to add an additional contingency, at the initial offer, the initial part of writing the offer, or even kind of after acceptance, they might want to add an additional contingency. So what are the best practices, how to insert them into the offer, where to put them, etc. So the first place I want to bring your attention to that I always kind of say the rule of thumb, if you ever need to add an additional contingency, whether it's the offer is contingent upon the seller painting the house blue or the seller doing repairs, in addendum A on the last page, there is a template called additional contingency. So it's line 211 to 218. So this is probably first and foremost the best place to look. When you need to add an additional contingency, this is probably the best place to insert it. But you can also just take pieces of this and then put it into additional provisions, either using this space in addendum A, or there's a small additional provision section of the residential offer to purchase. There's an even bigger additional provision section of the condo offer to purchase. So totally up to you where it goes. That's what the additional provision sections are for. But like I said, this is also just a really good template to use in the event you need to have an additional contingency. So it states, this offer is contingent upon blank. So you're simply going to state, what is that contingency? That seller is going to paint the house blue. Seller is going to repair certain pieces of the chimney. Seller is going to have the, something else repaired. I've even seen the flip side of maybe it's contingent upon the buyer seeing the property. So I've seen this written a few times in the kind of the market that we've been in, where a buyer's writing the offer sight unseen, but they want to include a contingency that allows them to see the property. So really anything can go in here. And then it goes on to include a deadline. So by when does this action need to take place? Then it goes on to say, in the event blank. So typically it's just in the event that contingency is not completed, that item addressed here is not done, or in the event buyer sees the house and they object for any reason. You can be as vague as you really want to be here. It goes on to say, buyer may at buyer's option terminate this offer by written notice delivered to seller within 3 days after the deadline stated here. Should the buyer fail to notify the seller, the buyer shall be deemed to have waived this contingency. So it has all those important components, which I'm going to talk about next, of what does an additional, or what does a contingency need to have. You can also flip this. I haven't really seen this, but you could flip it to be like a seller contingency. So some sellers ask, okay, can I make this offer contingent upon me finding suitable housing? So you could use it for the seller's benefit as well. You would just have to, in lines 217, where it says buyer, say seller, just kind of switching those things out. So in a situation like that, you may want to just rewrite the whole contingency using the additional provision so that it's clear what it's stating. Any questions on this additional contingency section? So like I said, it really can be used for pretty much anything, but it's just a nice template. So you don't have to think about, okay, what am I maybe missing in my contingency language? So in the event you're not using this, or just kind of a general rule of thumb, I'm going to just drop over here to this PDF. This is kind of like a quick little tutorial of how to write a contingency. So there's 5 basic parts to a contingency. You want to be sure you're addressing who is going to be responsible for the contingency. Is it a buyer contingency, seller contingency? What is the contingency? And be as specific as possible so that it's clear. How long does that contingency last? How long does the responsible party have to complete that contingency? So is it, if you have a closing date, is it 5 days before closing? Typically with repairs, you want those done no later than 5 days before closing or 10 days before closing. What happens if the contingency is not completed in time? Does the buyer have the right to declare the offer null and void? Does the buyer, it could be anything. And then how will we let people know that, or how will we let the other party know that the contingency is satisfied? So a common, again, template, very similar to what's in GMAR Addendum A, states this offer is contingent upon blank. So who completing what? What is the item in the contract that this contingency is discussing? Within how many days of acceptance or within how many days of closing shall this be completed? So I can email this out to you guys just to kind of have, in the event you ever have to write a your own contingency. But again, going back to GMAR Addendum A, this is really essentially, this is very similar to what's stated in the GMAR Addendum A. So kind of just rule of thumb, remember this piece of the offer or Addendum A that you can incorporate if you need to. A lot of the times what I see quite often actually is related to repairs in an offer. And it's almost like the contingency is almost written as we're agreeing to this to agree upon something later. So it might say like buyer, this offer is contingent upon buyer getting the roof inspected. Seller agrees to make repairs based on buyer's findings, and it's kind of like an unknown. Well, what is the seller really agreeing to? If there's any ever kind of question of that, it's not a clear contingency, and it should be rewritten. Really, the intent must be clear from both sides. So if you're a listing agent, you get an additional contingency that's not clear, you absolutely need to go back to the buyer's agent and clarify what those terms, what the buyer's intent is with the terms, to ensure that buyer and seller are on the same page. Because that's when, unfortunately, me as the broker, just agents in general, have to advise the parties to talk to an attorney if the language isn't clear and the buyer and seller are not agreeing. There's not much we can do to start interpreting what the language says. The next thing I want to just bring up, I'm going to drop in an amendment to the offer to purchase, because this is another time where you might be writing a contingency after acceptance. So this typically happens when buyer does their inspection and they learn about a number of items that need to be repaired. Basically, the buyer is now going to insert some additional contingencies into the offer that state what they want the seller to do prior to closing. So those are contingencies, because if the seller, the buyer's not going to purchase the property unless these things are done. That's what a contingency is. So when you're writing when you're drafting an amendment to the offer to purchase specific to repairs, we do have some pre-templated language that you can quickly insert into your amendment. So in zip form, I click on this pencil icon and then this paper icon. This will bring up the clause library. It's actually popped in the first one that came up. So it'll be under the category of the offer to purchase. You can see there's a few different other categories. And there's a number of different clauses to insert. So the one that we're talking about today right now is the inspection amendment clause. So I'm just going to insert this in here. And it states the following shall be completed at the expense of the seller. So who's doing it? With all applicable lien waivers, invoices, and permits provided to the buyer no later than 10 days prior to closing. So that answers the how long do they have to complete this? And then it goes on to say, upon acceptance by all parties, the inspection contingency is hereby waived. This piece is important because if it's not included, technically after agreeing to all these things, if the inspection deadline hasn't come and gone yet, or you're not at that point yet, the buyer could still come back the next day and ask for even more things. So always important to acknowledge that, okay, by agreeing to these things, buyer's waiving that inspection contingency, meaning we're no longer going to ask for anything. We're moving forward to the next, phase of the transaction. And then from here, you go on to list what are the different repairs that the buyer's expecting the seller to complete. Really important here to be very specific about, again, who's doing the repairs and how they are repaired. So a common mistake I see agents make is, let's say, for example, there's electrical work that needs to be done. Buyer could simply say, seller to have reverse polarity fixed, seller to have, if there's something with the circuit breaker, they can acknowledge all these things, but it's important to be specific that you don't want the seller doing these repairs. You want the seller to hire an electrician to do these repairs. So at the top here, of course, it says seller at seller's expense, but you want to be even more specific as you're going through each line item. So seller to hire licensed electrician to complete the following repairs. Same thing with plumbers, if there's any plumbing work. So being specific as far as a licensed plumber. Or like roofer, obviously they don't really have special licenses, but they're certified contractors. And really, this language up here protects your buyers in a way that invoices and permits are applicable or must be provided if they are applicable. So that kind of protects your buyers to ensure that the seller is, not just doing the work themselves. But again, the intent is, or the idea is you really want to be clear as to what is the buyer expecting the seller to do. Honestly, the cleanest inspection amendments are written using like an invoice or a bid from a specialist. So buyer does their inspection. They learn that from the inspector that, this electrical work probably isn't done correctly. Here's what I'm recommending. Either the buyer can bring in an electrician to evaluate further, or the seller can as well. And the electrician can write up a formal bid of, this is what I'm the expert, this is what I'm seeing of everything that needs to be done. So if you have those things in writing, it is so clear what is to be completed. And then you can reference that bid in the amendment. So seller to hire licensed electrician to complete the repairs per the attached bid. And there's no question as to what the seller is hiring somebody to do and how it's going to be repaired. Any questions on an amendment, drafting an amendment? I will also just show you, we do have a similar clause for a radon test. I'm sorry. This is it. Yeah, the radon test amendment. So if the buyer if the tested high for radon, including this clause that just acknowledges that it must be below a certain level and it must be retested to ensure it's below the level of 4.0. So using, I guess what I'm trying to get across is use these clauses to help you draft some of the additional language. It'll just ensure that you're not missing any key pieces. Awesome. That's really all I have for today. It's kind of a short and sweet training. So unless you guys have any questions that you want me to go through, whether it's related to additional contingencies or any kind of contract questions in general, I'm happy to go through anything right now.
Good, thank you though.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. You know where to reach me if you need anything.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Have a good one.